My name is Claire, and I'm 29 years old. For most of my life, I believed that the people who shared your blood were the ones you could count on when everything else fell apart. I believed that because I had to. Because the alternative that the people who were supposed to love you most could also hurt you worst was too terrifying to sit with. I stopped believing it on a Tuesday in November, when I woke up in a hospital bed in Portland, Oregon, with a fractured collarbone, 2 cracked ribs, a serious concussion, and absolutely no memory of the previous 2 days. The last thing I remembered was driving home from school. I teach 4th grade at Eastbrook Elementary, and I'd stayed late grading papers. It was raining hard, the way it does in Portland in the fall, that cold sideways rain that turns the roads into mirrors. A driver ran a red light at the intersection of Burnside and 23rd. I never saw him coming. The ER doctor, a calm woman named Dr. Reyes with silver-streaked hair, told me later that I'd been unconscious when the ambulance arrived. I had a severe concussion, and the internal imaging showed enough concern that they'd put me under observation for 48 hours, monitoring for swelling. Because I was unresponsive and they needed to make certain decisions about my care quickly, the hospital had contacted my emergency contact. My brother, Derek. He was 35, 6 years older than me, and he'd been my emergency contact since I moved to Portland 4 years ago. He was the one who'd helped me move into my apartment, the one who'd co-signed my lease when my credit history was still thin, the one who'd sat with me after our father passed 3 years ago and told me, through tears, that it was just the two of us now. That he would always have my back. Dr. Reyes told me he'd arrived at the hospital, confirmed my identity, spoken briefly with the attending physician and left. He did not stay. He did not wait for me to wake up. The first face I saw when I opened my eyes was not Derek's. It was my Aunt Patrice. She was sitting in the chair beside my bed with a paperback novel face down in her lap and a paper cup of vending machine coffee going cold in her hand. She was 58, my father's younger sister, a retired postal worker with short natural hair going silver at the temples and the same direct brown eyes my father had. She lived in Salem, about an hour south. When she saw me open my eyes, she set the book down without marking her page and leaned forward. "There she is," she said quietly. "Hey, sweetheart. You're okay. You're going to be okay. How long have you been here?" I asked. My voice came out rough and strange. "Since yesterday morning," she said. "Don't worry about that." I found out later she'd driven up the same night the hospital called Derek, after he'd called her briefly to say I was in the hospital and he couldn't stay because he and his wife Gwen had plans they couldn't cancel. She'd packed a bag and driven up in the rain without being asked. She'd been sleeping in that chair for 2 nights. I lay there in the hospital light and thought about that. Derek, who had my phone number memorized. Derek, who had plans he couldn't cancel. Aunt Patrice, who packed a bag and just came. When Derek finally showed up, it was the afternoon of my 3rd day in the hospital, a full 2.5 days after I'd been admitted. He came with Gwen, who smelled like expensive perfume and kept glancing at her phone. He stood at the foot of my bed in his work coat and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as managed concern, the kind you perform rather than feel. "You gave us a real scare," he said. Aunt Patrice, who was still there, was very quiet in her corner chair. "Where were you?" I asked. I hadn't planned to say it that directly. It came out anyway. Derek's jaw tightened slightly. "I came as soon as I could. We had obligations, Claire. I can't just drop everything." Gwen smiled with her mouth only. "We're so glad you're feeling better." They stayed 40 minutes. Derek spent a portion of it taking a phone call in the hallway. Gwen ate a granola bar from her purse. When they left, Derek squeezed my good hand and said he'd check in soon. The door eased shut behind them and Aunt Patrice looked over at me and said nothing, which somehow said everything. I didn't understand yet what check-in soon was actually going to look like. The discharge conversation happened 2 days later. The doctor explained I'd need at least 4 to 6 weeks of limited activity. No driving, given the concussion. My apartment was a 3rd-floor unit with no elevator. "Is there somewhere else you can stay?" Dr. Reyes asked. I was already pulling out my phone to call Derek when Aunt Patrice spoke from the corner. "She's coming home with me," she said simply. "My house is 1 floor. I'm retired, and I've got a room already made up." She said it the way you state a fact that was never in question. So I went to Salem. Her house was small and warm and smelled like cedar and the lavender sachets she kept in every room. She had a garden in the backyard that had gone dormant for winter but still had the structure of something carefully tended. She made soup from scratch and sat with me during the slow, grinding work of physical therapy exercises and never once made me feel like a burden. In the quiet of her house, away from the noise of my own life, I had a lot of time to think. And in that thinking, I started feeling something I was ashamed of. I kept checking my phone for a message from Derek. Not even a long message, just something. "How are you today? And I'm thinking about you." I knew how illogical that was. I could see clearly, from the outside, that he had already told me exactly who he was. But there's something about the people you grew up with, the ones who held the same grief you held, that makes you keep extending credit they haven't earned. I'd read something once about how children who receive inconsistent affection, sometimes warmth, sometimes nothing, actually become more attached to the source of that inconsistency, not less. The unpredictability becomes its own kind of hook. You stay waiting because the next good thing always feels like it might be right around the corner. I had been waiting on Derek for 3 years, since our father died, and I was only now starting to understand that the corner I'd been looking around wasn't there. I was lying in Aunt Patrice's guest room with that realization sitting heavy on my chest when my phone buzzed. It was an email notification from my bank. Account access from an unrecognized device. I sat up too fast and my ribs reminded me immediately why that was a bad idea. I caught my breath and opened the app with shaking hands. The notification was from 2 days ago. It had been caught in a spam filter and I was only seeing it now. A login attempt on my savings account from a device I didn't recognize, with an IP address traced to a neighborhood in Northeast Portland where Derek and Gwen lived. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I went to my email and started reading things I had been too foggy and exhausted to read since waking up in the hospital. There were automated messages I'd skimmed past, figuring they were routine. But they weren't. There was a message from the HR portal at my school district, flagged as a response to an inquiry about my 403B account, the retirement fund I'd been contributing to for 4 years. The message was a reply to a question about early withdrawal procedures, hardship distribution eligibility, and the documentation required to access funds on behalf of an account holder who was incapacitated or otherwise unable to manage their own affairs. The inquiry had been sent from my personal email address 3 days after my accident. While I was unconscious, I had not sent that email. I called the HR benefits office the next morning. A woman named Sandra answered, and when I explained who I was and what I was looking at, she pulled up the record. Yes, she confirmed, someone had accessed my email and sent that inquiry. They had also, 2 days after that, called the benefits line directly, identified themselves as my representative, and asked detailed questions about the process for emergency access to a retirement account in cases of medical incapacitation. Did they provide any documentation? I asked. My voice was very steady. I was surprised by that. They were in the process of gathering it, Sandra said carefully. We hadn't moved forward with anything. We do require a formal power of attorney for that kind of request. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat with what I knew. Derek had arrived at the hospital within hours of my accident. He had access to my emergency contact information. He knew roughly what I owned. We talked after our father's estate settled, compared notes about retirement savings, made vague sibling promises about being smarter with money than our parents had been. He knew I had a 403B. He knew I'd been depositing into a savings account steadily for years. But there was still the question of how he'd gotten into my email. I went to my email security settings and looked at the connected devices. There was one I didn't recognize, added 4 years ago. 4 years ago, when Derek had helped me set up my new laptop after I moved to Portland, he'd been sitting right there while I logged into everything, and at some point, without me knowing, he had connected his own device to my account and never removed it. 4 years. He'd had a backdoor into my email for 4 years. The ice that moved through me then wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder and more clarifying than anger. It was the feeling of seeing a room you thought you knew suddenly lit from a completely different angle, revealing all the shapes you'd missed in the familiar dark. I called Aunt Patrice into the room and showed her everything. She read each thing slowly, the way she did everything, and when she was done she set the phone down on the bedside table and folded her hands in her lap. This isn't the first time he's done something like this, she said. I looked at her. After your father passed, she said carefully, there were some irregularities with the estate. Small things. A bill paid late that shouldn't have been. A small account that closed before probate was finished. I didn't have proof of anything and you were grieving. I didn't want to put more on you. She paused. I should have told you. I'm sorry I didn't. We sat with that for a moment. Okay, I said. What do we do? Aunt Patrice stood up, went to the kitchen, and came back with her address book, an actual paper address book, the kind nobody keeps anymore, with a cracked spine and pages that had been turned so many times the edges were soft. She flipped to a page near the middle and handed it to me with her finger on a name. Margaret Holloway, attorney at law. Below it, a Salem phone number written in Aunt Patrice's careful handwriting. She handled your father's estate, Aunt Patrice said. She's good. She's honest. And she will be very interested in what you have to show her. Margaret Holloway was 61 years old, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the kind of focused attention that made you feel like every word you said was being recorded and filed. She came to the house 2 days later because I still wasn't cleared to drive, and she sat at Aunt Patrice's kitchen table and listened to everything I told her without interrupting once. When I finished, she looked at her notes for a moment. The unauthorized email access alone is potentially criminal, she said. Using it to query your employer about your retirement funds, while you were hospitalized and unable to consent, moves this into serious territory. What I want to know is whether he made any actual transfers or access attempts on the savings account. I'd already been back through the records. There had been 2 failed login attempts, both from the same unrecognized device, both in the 3 days after my accident. My bank's 2-factor authentication had stopped them. By the time I'd regained consciousness and was using my phone normally, my presence on the account had essentially locked him out. Margaret wrote something on her legal pad. He was stopped by the technology. But the intent is documented. She looked up at me. Here's what I want you to do. First, you are going to file a report with the Portland Police Department documenting the unauthorized account access. Second, I am going to draft a formal cease and desist. Third, and most importantly, we are going to go through every single legal document in your life, every account, every beneficiary designation, every emergency contact form, and we are going to remove his name from all of it. He's my emergency contact at the hospital, I said. Not anymore, she said. And at work. And on my lease. We'll go through all of it, she said. You're going to designate your aunt as your new emergency contact, your new medical proxy, and your new financial proxy. You're going to create a healthcare directive and a durable power of attorney that are explicit and limited. They say exactly what she can and cannot do on your behalf, under what circumstances, and they expire if not renewed. She paused. I also want you to change every password connected to every account you have, starting today. New email. New bank login. New everything. She said it the way a doctor delivers a treatment plan, not asking, just informing. And something in that steadiness made the fear that had been living in my chest since I'd seen that email notification start, just slightly, to loosen. I did everything she told me to do. I filed the police report. I changed every password. I removed Derek's name from every document I could find. I sat with Aunt Patrice at her kitchen table for 3 evenings going through paperwork, and I found 3 other places where Derek was listed a small joint savings account we'd opened together after our father died, for family emergencies, that I had mostly forgotten about and stopped contributing to. He was a co-owner, which meant he had full access. Margaret advised me to document the current balance, withdraw my share, and close it. We also found an old beneficiary designation on a small life insurance policy I'd taken out at 22 when Derek had helped me with the paperwork. He was the primary beneficiary. I changed it to Aunt Patrice. None of these individual things were dramatic. But together, they told a story. He hadn't been waiting for me to get in an accident. I don't think it was that calculated. I think what happened was simpler and sadder than that. He had been quietly keeping doors open for years, maintaining access he had no right to, and when I ended up in the hospital unconscious, vulnerable, temporarily unreachable, he saw an opportunity. He moved on it immediately, before he even knew if I was going to be okay. That was the part I kept coming back to in the quiet of those evenings. Not the legal documents, not the failed logins, but the fact that he had arrived at the hospital, stood in the room where his sister was unconscious, and his first thought within 72 hours was to start making calls about her retirement account. I had given him the benefit of the doubt my entire adult life. Every time he didn't show up. Every birthday he forgot. Every call that went to voicemail during hard stretches. I had told myself he was busy, he was under pressure. That was just how he was. The way you tell yourself stories to make the love you want to have for someone still feel possible. The accident didn't change who Derek was. It just turned on the lights. 3 weeks after I left the hospital, Margaret told me everything was in order. The documents were ready. She had sent the cease and desist to Derek's home address. Now it was time for the conversation. I called him and asked him to come to Aunt Patrice's house. I didn't tell him what it was about. He said he was busy, and could we do it over the phone, and I said no, and something in my voice must have been different enough from every other time I'd said no, because he agreed. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon with Gwen. They pulled into the driveway in his new car, a car I remembered him mentioning he'd financed aggressively, and came to the door together. Gwen's expression was the careful neutral of someone who already knew, at least partially, what was coming. Aunt Patrice let them in without warmth but without hostility either. Just opened the door and stepped aside. I was sitting on the couch in the living room. I was off the sling, still moving carefully, but I was sitting straight. On the coffee table in front of me was a manila envelope. Next to it was a legal pad with notes. Next to that was my phone, screen up. Derek looked at the setup and his expression shifted into something I recognized, the particular irritation of someone who has expected to control a situation and realized they might not. "What is this?" he said. He didn't sit down. "Sit down, Derek," I said. Gwen sat. He stayed standing for another few seconds, then sat. "I know what you did," I said. He started to open his mouth and I held up my hand. "I know about the email access. I know about the inquiry to HR about my 403(b). I know about the 2 failed login attempts on my savings account. I have documentation of all of it. It's been reported to the Portland Police Department. And Margaret Holloway has already sent you the cease and desist, which I know you received because Margaret has the delivery confirmation." The room was very quiet. Derek's face went through several things quickly. Surprise, then calculation, then something that was almost contempt. And then finally, when he looked at me and saw that I was not going to look away, something that looked a little like the first honest thing I'd seen on his face in a long time. "Claire," he said. His voice had changed. Gone flat. "The firm is underwater. You don't understand the kind of pressure." "You're right," I said. "I don't. And it's not my problem. You're my sister." "I was in the hospital," I said. "Unconscious. And you spent those 2 days trying to get into my retirement account." Gwen looked at her hands. "I wasn't going to take it," he said. "It would have been a loan. I was going to pay it back." "You were going to take it without asking me," I said. "Well, I couldn't stop you. That's not a loan. That's not a family emergency fund. That's you deciding that what you needed was more important than what I might need, and betting that I wouldn't be able to do anything about it." He didn't say anything. "I need you to understand something," I said, and I slid the envelope across the coffee table toward him. "These are documents that remove you from every legal role in my life. Emergency contact, medical proxy, financial proxy, beneficiary, all of it gone. You are also removed from the joint account, which I have already closed. Your access to my email has been revoked and the security incident has been reported. Margaret's office will be monitoring for any further unauthorized access attempts." He looked at the envelope without touching it. "You need to sign the account closure acknowledgement," I said. "That's the only page that requires your signature. Everything else is already done." "This is," he started. "I know you're angry," I said. "I know this doesn't feel fair to you. And I want to be honest with you, Derek, because I think you deserve honesty even now. I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because I cannot trust you. And I cannot be in situations where I need to trust you. That's not something I can choose. It's just true." His jaw worked. Gwen put her hand briefly on his arm and then took it back. He picked up the envelope, opened it, found the page. He read it slowly. Then he took the pen I'd left on the table. I thought to leave a pen, which felt, in the moment, like a small piece of armor, and he signed it. He put it back on the table. He stood up. Gwen stood up. He looked at me for a moment, and I looked back, and I didn't know what I expected to feel, but what I actually felt was something quiet, not victory. Not grief, exactly. Just the specific stillness of a door closing cleanly, latch clicking into place. "Tell me something," he said. Not angry anymore. Just asking. "Did you mean any of it? After Dad? When you said we'd take care of each other?" I thought about it honestly. "I did," I said. "I meant all of it. I don't think you did, though. Or maybe you did and couldn't do it anyway. I'm not sure which is sadder." He left. He didn't look back at me. The front door closed and Aunt Patrice came in from the kitchen where she'd been giving us space, and she sat down beside me on the couch and put her arm around my shoulders very gently, careful of my collarbone. We sat there for a while without talking. "I want to tell you something about the weeks that came after, because the story doesn't end with the envelope on the coffee table. The story continues, and the continuing is the part that actually matters. I went back to my apartment when my doctor cleared me. Aunt Patrice helped me move, which mostly meant she drove and told me to stop trying to carry boxes. I took the third-floor stairs slowly, one at a time, and I stood in my living room and looked at it, the same apartment, same furniture, a same view of the street, and it felt like coming back to a place that had shifted imperceptibly while I was gone. I went back to my classroom the following Monday. 22 9-year-olds, none of whom knew or cared that I'd spent a month in crisis, who just wanted to know if we could do the papier-mâché project today because I'd promised it before Thanksgiving. We did the papier-mâché project. It was chaotic and wonderful, and I got paste on my sleeve and one kid stuck newspaper to the back of another kid's hair, and I had to spend 10 minutes on a gentle untangling operation while everyone dissolved into laughter, and I found myself laughing too, fully, for the first time since the accident. Healing is not a line. It's more like a field you move through, and sometimes you don't know how deep in the difficult part you are until you find yourself stepping out of it, and you look back and realize how far you walked. I want to say something about the legal pieces, because when I've talked to friends about what happened, the thing that surprised people most was how easy it was for Derek to have the access he did and how easy it was to take it back, once I knew to look. Most of us set up emergency contacts and proxy designations when we're young and don't think much about them. When I first moved out at 22, someone told me to list a family member as my emergency contact, and I listed Derek because he was the nearest family and I trusted him. I never updated it. I never thought about who that person actually was and what access that gave them. I never thought about what it meant that he was on my lease, that he'd helped set up accounts, that his device was connected to my email for 4 years because I'd never audited my connected devices. Margaret told me everyone should do a legal and account audit at least every few years, and more importantly, everyone should think carefully about who their proxies actually are, not just who they're supposed to be. You can have a limited healthcare directive that specifies exactly what decisions someone can and cannot make for you, under what circumstances, with what constraints. You can name different people for medical decisions and financial decisions. You can name someone outside your immediate family. You can name a friend who you trust more than a sibling, an aunt who drove through the rain without being asked. Your proxies should be people who have shown up, not people who are supposed to. I changed my emergency contact at work, at the hospital's records office, and on my lease. Aunt Patrice is listed now. I made her my healthcare proxy with a clear directive, and I made her my limited financial proxy with specific, defined conditions for when and how she can act on my behalf. We talked through it together and she asked good questions, and she also said, very Patrice-like, that she hoped she never needed to use any of it. Same, I said. But it's good to have, she said. Yeah, I said. It's good to have. Derek and I haven't spoken since the Saturday at Aunt Patrice's house. I don't know what's happening with his firm. I don't know if he and Gwen are okay. I find that I can hold those unknowns without the old ache, mostly. The thing about finally seeing someone clearly is that once you see it, the longing and the person in the longing sort of separate. You mourn the version of the brother you wanted, not the one who actually stood in your hospital room and made calls about your savings account before he even knew if you'd wake up. The brother I wanted would have stayed, would have sat in the chair the way Aunt Patrice sat, with a paperback novel and vending machine coffee and no sense that there was anywhere else he was supposed to be. That brother doesn't exist. I've grieved him. I'm done. What does exist is Aunt Patrice, who came without being asked. Ben, one of my fourth graders' fathers, who knocked on my door in October with a lasagna because his daughter had told him I was recovering from an accident, and he thought I might not feel like cooking, and who has, very slowly, become something more than a lasagna-bearing acquaintance over the past few months. My colleague Dana, who covered my classes without complaint and sent me ridiculously detailed updates about classroom drama that made me laugh out loud in a hospital bed in Salem. Margaret Holloway, who sat at a kitchen table and said, here's what we're going to do, with the calm certainty of someone who has helped women like me find their footing before and will help them again. My family is these people. It is Aunt Patrice's house that smells like cedar and lavender. It is a lasagna left at my door. It is 22 kids who wanted to do papier-mâché. I came home from school last week and Aunt Patrice was visiting. She comes up to Portland once a month now, and she'd brought a cutting from her lavender plant in Salem, wrapped in a damp paper towel, to put in a pot on my windowsill. We made dinner together and talked for 3 hours about nothing in particular and everything important, and I looked at her across the table and thought, this is what I almost lost. Not her, she was never going anywhere. But the ability to see her clearly. The habit of looking past what I had toward what I thought I was supposed to want. Blood doesn't make a family. Showing up makes a family. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in what I've described, that particular ache of waiting for someone who keeps almost showing up, the habit of calling neglect something more forgivable, I want to say this as clearly as I can. You are not wrong about what you need. You are not too much. You are not too sensitive. You are not ungrateful. The pain is real and it's pointing at something real. The people you were given don't have to be the people you keep. Look around at who actually came. Who stayed in the chair. Who drove through the rain. That's your family, whether or not you share a name. You get to choose. That's not a betrayal of anything. That's just finally being honest about what home means. And if you're in a situation where someone close to you has access to your financial or legal life, please go audit that right now. Check your emergency contacts. Check your account beneficiaries. Check the devices connected to your email. Check who can speak on your behalf if you can't speak for yourself. It takes an hour and it matters more than most of us realize until we're lying in a hospital bed wishing we'd done it sooner. Take care of yourself. The version of you that's still waiting for someone to show up, she deserves better. She deserves someone who shows up without being asked. She deserves you.